So Rachel, do you want to introduce or do you want me to? What do you want to do?
Um, okay. Welcome. This is Michelle Shaw and her family. Yusuto and Abasi are her sons. Yusuto's wife is Diana, and Christina is Abasi's wife. And then her mother's here, Jocelyn, and her sister Joanne. And they're here to give us millennial perspective. Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, Alan. Alan.
That's fine.
And her family is here to give us millennial perspectives on race. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
So essentially, they're going to run it, and yeah, we'll have.
That's wonderful. We should say a prayer before we start. We always pray. Would you like me to lead us in prayer? Durante, would you like to do prayer?
I can do prayer.
Okay.
Heavenly Father, thank you for being such a gracious God and for being invested in the troubles and issues of this world. We thank you for your love and your kindness, your directive to reconcile both within the kingdom, but also to those who are outside the kingdom, Father. I thank you for putting it on Dan's heart to give us the agency to start this this group where we could have these discussions and community together and just be able to think through, like, how do we approach these issues of race in our society? How do we stand against the enemy and sowing seeds of division and destruction, both in our country, but also across the globe? And so, Father, I pray that you bless the thoughts and the conversations that come out of this panel today. And I ask that you bless this family for being willing to share their thoughts and perspectives on race in the 21st century. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so hand it over to Yesuto.
All right. I will go ahead and share my screen. And I just switched to my phone audio. Can you all still hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Give me 1 second here. There we go. And I'll just pull this into the slideshow view. Okay, great. So we've titled this "Racial Reconciliation: A Millennial Perspective," and where we're coming from this, when my mom asked us to present, was kind of the idea that we can share a bit about what we have seen in terms of racial equality, as well as racial reconciliation and integration, kind of from our perspective. All of us were born between 94 and 96, I think, so very specific range of years, but kind of came of age, long after the civil rights movement and in the midst of affirmative action and so on. And so just wanted to share kind of how we've seen racial reconciliation, as well as where we believe there's still room to grow within society. So we'll start with some introductions, and then we'll talk about a few specific areas where we feel that there are still signs of failure, as well as signs of progress. Those 4 areas you can see here: the racial wealth gap, some leadership gaps in society, the school to prison pipeline, which we'll define later, and then just the general interpersonal reactions that are what people kind of tend to think of as racism and racist behavior. We'll leave that for last because the institutional levels of racism, we think, are probably where there are some of the largest gaps still. So just to provide a bit of a high-level kind of takeaway of the presentation, from the perspective that we see it, that there have been significant progresses in advancing racial equality in America. However, there are these long-standing negative impacts of slavery, of racist oppression and segregation and redlining and all of these policies that had taken place for a very long time, which for the most part are now illegal. And for now, like in the eyes of the law, of course, we have equality. But the issue that we kind of want to talk through today is that equality doesn't just come immediately. And I'm sure you've talked about this a lot in your group, but that there are it will take many years to continue to get to a place of true equality and really right the wrongs of many of the injustices that have been seen over time. And so we'll also talk about some of the areas. So we'll focus on some of the areas where we believe there is still ongoing inequality, and then we'll talk about some of the areas of progress. So for each one, we'll explain some of the inequality, and then we'll talk about the progress. And then within each one, we'd love to stop for questions. So we'll give those 2 slides for each one, the failures and the progress, share a bit about our experiences, and then open it up for questions on that particular topic. So definitely feel free to jump in and ask questions as we go. And then we'll just try to share some of our personal experiences. I think some of this we have personal experience with, and some we don't. Some are just things that we've kind of seen around us or in conversations with peers. So we'll kind of go back and forth a little bit from that perspective. So I won't go into details on these right now, as we're going to go into detail on each one, but we'll start by just providing a bit of introduction and background on ourselves. So as mentioned, my name is Yasuto. I'm one of Michelle and Alan's sons. I graduated from Dartmouth with a degree in psychology as well as a minor in government back in 2015. And I'm currently getting my business school MBA degree at Kellogg at Northwestern University in Chicago. Prior to business school, I was a business analyst at Capital One, where I primarily did a mix of product strategy and data analytics to continue to drive profitability with our credit card products. And then prior to that, I spent a year in strategy consulting at a very small firm in the DC area. And now I'm pivoting more into technology, which is why I'm in business school. And I am currently interning at LinkedIn, where I work as a product manager, working with engineers, but more on the strategy side of tech. So that's my background. Diana, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Diana. I'm Yasuto's wife. I went to Harvard for undergrad, studied economics with a focus on international development. And after college, spent a few years jumping around a few different corporate jobs, as you saw. Also, similarly, did a lot of like strategy, operations, and analytics. But clearly it was not meant for big companies. So I decided to also go get my MBA. I've been focusing a lot on entrepreneurship. And right now, interning at a really small startup. It's only 7 of us. But especially after school, I want to focus a lot on social entrepreneurship and how businesses can be designed better, specifically for-profit businesses, to help build more economic opportunities for people. So that is what I hope to do after school.
I'm Obasi. I was undergrad with Diana at Harvard. And then I went to Google to be a software engineer after that, and actually was a software engineer technically just for 1 year, and then became a technical program manager for the next 3 years, working on trying to make improvements to Google's interview processes to make broadly to try to make the interview processes at Google more equitable. And then I actually, about a year ago, spun out of Google with a startup that spun out of Google that works specifically on that. So I'm now leading assessment development at a company that creates like interviews for software engineers. So yeah.
Hello, Christina. I went to Wellesley College where I studied education policy and sociology. And after graduating, I worked in policy research and also at a nonprofit that served kids and families. And so I'm continuing to kind of do policy research work. I'm getting a master's in public policy right now. And after school, I hope to stay in policy research. Yeah.
Great. So we will now shift into each of these topics. One of us will kind of share some of the signs of failure, and then someone else will share signs of progress. Then we'll talk a bit about personal experiences and open for questions at each one. So the first one is the racial wealth gap. This one I think most people are somewhat aware of, but I think one of the things that has been surprising to me, even in looking into this more, is the degree to which it really hasn't improved over time. As you can see in this first bullet, there's actually still a slightly larger gap than existed even in the 1960s. So as everyone has gotten, you know, in a better and better situation to some degree since that time, there still has been a growing gap to some degree between white families and Black families. And so we can talk a little bit about potentially reasons for that, but I think a lot of the reasons that I believe that can continue to lead to that is just that there have been, as families pass down wealth from one to the next, it can be hard for other families to catch up, right? If wealth remains really concentrated within those who already have it. So it just kind of goes to show that by having people treated like fully equally right now, it's not actually bringing about equity where people can get to the same footing. It's kind of just we started from the 60s trying to get to equality, but need to recognize that Black families continue to start from a further back kind of starting point from a wealth standpoint. And of course, this is just averages across the two races. And then similarly, the home ownership remains a significant gap. As you can see here, 76% of white Americans own homes and only 44% of Black Americans do. So that's just an ongoing gap that we've seen. And that honestly, in terms of progress, probably will take many, many years to get to progress, but you could even see why people may call for reparations and things along those lines from a perspective of, like, we really haven't been equal from a financial perspective after coming out of eras of oppression. So I'll turn it over to Christina to talk a little bit, though, about some signs of progress here.
Yeah. A sign of progress is that conditional on parents' income. So that's a huge sort of like, caveat to this. Black women earn about the same or even sometimes more than white women in terms of their individual earnings. And so when at least Black women have the same sort of family income or background as their white counterparts, they are able to earn as much money, which is like, encouraging that there's opportunities to like see the fruits of your labor, I guess, and that they're not like stymied when they strive for like greater, income and jobs and that kind of thing. And then we've also seen an increase in Black people obtaining bachelor's and master's, degrees. So I find this really like, encouraging and positive. Although I would still say that it's very precarious and that because there's not that wealth building mechanism, it means that Black women can still sort of fall down the like, economic ladder when there's less sort of savings to fall back on. But nevertheless, it's great to see that like Black women at least can, strive and see that, income. This trend does not hold for Black men. And so a lot of the difference in income that you see in Black families is because of these institutional factors and things that are holding Black men back, especially. And so it's very like nuanced, I think, this whole conversation. And it's important to sort of tease out where there are signs of progress and not signs of progress. Then I also say personally in my life, I've seen this trend certainly hold in my family and in my like peer circle. And so people who I went to school with, like Black women who I went to school with, we are all doing about as well as our peers. Whereas for the Black men I went to school with, that's not the case. I think that they struggle a lot more. And then even in my like personal family, I see the like woman in my family all doing like relatively well income wise. And then for men, it's just been so much harder. Yeah. So sorry to sort of douse that with a few stats as well, but I wanted to highlight that sign of progress.
Great. And so I'll just add a bit of a personal color as well. I think one of the things that I saw with a lot of friends who were first generation college students, especially coming from Black communities, was the need and desire to send money back to their families. So it's been interesting, I think, from the perspective of seeing how education can improve a family overall, just seeing kids, who are 18, 19, and kind of working outside of the home. And then as they get into their 20s and have higher paying careers than their parents who didn't have a bachelor's degree or the opportunities of education that they had, then feeling like they can now go back and support their families, their parents, and help them kind of come out of poverty themselves. But again, of course, that does mean that they also have less to give to their kids. So it's kind of like means it takes longer also for generational wealth to develop. But it is promising that education can help reduce some of these gaps. So with that, we'll pause for any questions on this, if anyone has any, or just comments or a little discussion.
I'm looking at some data. I've actually seen that not only is it not the same for Black men, right? That Black women have achieved a type of parity when they come from the same background as white women, but when Black men come from the same background as white men in terms of wealth, in terms of middle class standing, they actually fall out of the middle class status at something like at the highest rate of anybody. They something like I don't know, about half of the Black men who are born into middle class homes end up not staying in middle class status as they get into their own adult years. So anyway, obviously there's the prison pipeline that what do you call it? The school to prison pipeline kind of gets at the thing that it's a large percentage of Black men are caught up in the school to prison pipeline. It's really holding back, which I think is coming later. But I just thought it would just be interesting to point out that it's not just not parity. It's almost like more or some number, almost half of Black men can't maintain the same level of middle class status that their parents have.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about just along those lines that I think is really interesting is that I think that racism, the primary effect of racism is that it enforces poverty. There's a lot of kind of, there's microaggressions, there's, all sorts of things that people who are, people of color have to deal with. But I think that the primary thing that racism does is it creates poverty, and it ensures that some people, some groups of people or it tries to at least ensure that people are in poverty. And I think that, the most effective ways to do that are to enslave people or put people in prison. And so that's slavery was a really, really effective way of enforcing poverty on African, immigrants or the people that were brought in from Africa. When slavery ended, we no longer had access, or the people who wanted to continue using racism to kind of enforce this class of poverty no longer had that tool, and so they started coming up with other tools, and that's why imprisonment and the 13th Amendment, where you couldn't enslave people unless you found a way to make them a criminal and put them in jail, and then you can have their slave labor. And so I think that what racism has always tried to do is find ways to reinforce poverty. And so what I find really interesting about that is a couple of things. I think that when Black people are able to escape from poverty, I think that they genuinely do escape from most of the effects of racism, in the sense that what racism does, racism, for example, isn't why most Black people died of COVID, for example, at a significantly higher rate. It's poverty that was the reason, but it was racism which enforced the poverty. So it was Black people who are in essential roles or who don't have access to good health care. And that's because they're in these impoverished communities. But the reason they're in impoverished communities is because racism is enforcing that poverty. But Black people who are able to escape from that, who are kind of slip through the cracks of the enforcement that systemic racism tries to do, end up like being significantly better off, I think. But the reason I'm bringing all of that up is because of this thing that like my dad was just talking about how like Black men end up being brought back into poverty. And like something I've been thinking about like very recently is the idea that while people who like Black people who are not in poverty have in some sense really escaped from most of the effects of racism, they're still kind of being hunted down. Like it's kind of like they are constantly on the run from this law enforcement of racism trying to bring them back into poverty. And I just find that really interesting, just thinking about like how even Black people who are Black boys who are born into these middle class or even affluent families are often brought back down because of like the ways that the system kind of tries to enforce a certain class on people of color. So I just find that really interesting.
And I guess again, we'll talk about it at that point. But the lifelong damage that a prison record causes you, I mean, literally every job does a background check, and it literally follows you for the rest of your life. There's no escaping that background check.
I was going to ask a question about that wealth gap chart. It's actually a lot worse than what it shows, because if you think about it, some of that dollar increases from just the dollar increasing in value, but you look at the rate at which the white wealth continued to go at pretty much what the economic change in dollar value in 1950s worse than now, whereas the curve for Black families was almost flat. I mean, so it's even worse than just the differential component. When people say it's a 10-to-1 ratio or whatever, it's actually a lot worse than that when you think about it.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point.
Yeah, that is a good point.
She made a comment that there's more Black people in prison now than there were slaves.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, since the war on drugs that happened.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Just
and being the wealthiest country, in the world, it's just amazing that we have the highest percentage of people in the world in any country in prison. We have the highest percentage of people in prison, and we're the wealthiest country. Just seems like we should be able to figure something out, to have fewer people in prison when we have that much wealth.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I don't know if I'm starting to think this way. I find it like increasingly like seems more likely in my mind that this is by design, in the sense that like, so there was an article in the Atlantic about a week ago from a legal scholar who was talking about how he was researching the history of trespassing laws in the United States, and everything was leading back to the year 1865, which happens to be the year of the Civil War. And so what was interesting was that he found that before that year, there were no trespassing. Like trespassing was just not illegal. Like you could be anywhere, you could be on somebody else's property, you could camp out on somebody's property. And as long as you weren't harming them in any way, the courts would do nothing about it, because they'd say, well, this person is like, you have no right to like make people not be here. If they're going to do something to that, that's one thing, but there's no problem with people existing here. But then after 1865, after the Civil War, two states, I don't remember which ones, I think it was like Alabama and somewhere, I think, immediately passed like a slew of laws to try to kind of reverse the effects of slavery ending. So some of the laws they passed were that like Black employees had to call their employers master, and that they could be whipped by their employers, and their employers could prevent them from leaving their property, or they'd need to get employer permission to leave the employer's property. So basically trying to reinstitute slavery. But those laws got immediately kind of struck down by the Union officials. But there were some other kind of laws that they tried to pass, that they passed at the same time as well. And those laws some of those laws were the first trespassing laws, where they were saying if a person was found on property that they were not allowed to be on, then they could be, significantly punished. And the goal of those laws was essentially the same thing as the other laws, which was to prevent Black people from being able to like leave their master's property. And then also to, if Black people did get caught somewhere where they were not, allowed to be based on these new rules, then you could impose all of these. You could basically institute slavery as punishment for a crime, which I just think is really interesting. Like I think that a lot of the laws that we take for granted and think, well, this is just the way things are kind of designed in order to, or were designed in order to, again, kind of reinforce or try to recreate some of the conditions that slavery was like had created, but there was no longer an ability to create those conditions with slavery. So I just think it's interesting. I think that it's kind of like the fact that we have so many Black people in prison right now is, I think, a direct result of the end of slavery and the systems that were in place trying to like reassert themselves and reasserting themselves in ways that I think become a little bit less precise. Like slavery was a really, really precise way of like enforcing poverty on Black people and kind of taking their agency away from them. But then when you couldn't do slavery, then you create these laws that maybe some white people will get caught up in as well. But the goal is really that you're able to still kind of control the Black population, which is interesting.
Just to add to that too, with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. So one thing that she talks about is that in other countries, people for drug offenses, they might get, first of all, you don't get prison a lot of times. You might get up to 6 months or something, but there's nothing like what you get here, where you get years for a drug offense. And that's just a completely different kind of way of dealing with, it's more of trying to get people in prison. And the other thing is that she goes through the statistics that show that, in general, and I had mentioned something at the beginning of the meeting before, but in the general, whites use drugs as much as or more than Blacks, but the prisons are full of the Black people who are getting caught with the same kind of things that the white people are doing. So there's something more going on as far as the whole prison thing, as far as who's going to prison, especially the idea that why are we putting people in prison for years for a lot of times it's possession and it's of small amounts and there was a whole crack versus powder cocaine stuff and all of that kind of thing that happened. So it does seem like there's some kind of design that's bigger than just Black people are more criminals than white people. It's just not, it doesn't make sense that that's the case.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think, go ahead, Rachel, were you going to say something else?
No, it's okay. You can go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, just from a perspective of progress and next steps there. So I think a lot of what we've been talking about here is that it does seem like it's very likely that the prison system and the way criminal justice system really is overrepresented in the mass incarceration of Black men in particular, has a lot of the cause potentially behind this racial wealth gap as just at least one of the causes. But I think from the perspective of next steps there, I think it's been good to see this conversation more with Michelle Alexander's book. There was a bill, I think, passed a couple of years ago now that has been trying to reduce some of those incredibly harsh punishments on nonviolent drug offenders, especially. I think some of the stuff that hasn't happened yet has been like commuting some of the crimes of people who are already imprisoned and sentenced under the older penalties. But then also, I think one of the things that there's a conversation about but hasn't been adjusted as much is how do we allow people who are coming out of prison to enter the workforce and the work system better. And my dad mentioned that like it follows you for so long. So then if you got caught up in something or, were caught with some amount of drugs as a teenager and you went to prison and now you're, 30 years old and you're trying to work, like it seems like society isn't really welcoming you to work in a way that's constructive. So then you're kind of in this underground system. If the only way to work is to continue doing something criminal or something that's not on the books. And so I think just continuing the conversation around how to bring people back into the economy after coming out of prison, I think would be a really beneficial thing here.
Yeah. There's a podcast called the Faith Driven Entrepreneur Podcast, and recently listened to one where a gentleman who was in prison had gotten part of a prison entrepreneurship program, I think is the name. And these kids where you're kind of talking about, I think they're really starting to address like, how can you build more skills and opportunities for people while they're in prison? But what he faced, of course, when he came out, I think probably something like 20 years of prison, is this like massive record. It was for murder, so also it was like there's no getting around that. But one thing he ended up talking about was he did an interview and just like addressed it up front with the person. Was like, just want to call this out and not, try to hide it. But he ended up being able to talk about a lot of the things that he had like learned, a lot of the skills, the disciplines, like a lot of, like, was basically able to find language to communicate why he'd be a great employee, and had been working there for like years since, and like the person decided to hire him. But I think you said, to your point, like that almost never happens. Like people aren't willing to look past a lot of records, and normally it's just a screen before you even get to have a conversation with anybody. So there's still like so much work to be done. But I thought it was an encouraging story to hear the way they're both like programs specifically around entrepreneurship and business, and that those are continuing to grow within the prison systems, but also that there's more of a conversation like how can you actually like communicate like why, like how, just be better, or get to a point where you can talk to employers and talk about why they should actually be more open-minded to hiring people with records. So I thought that was a really cool take if anyone wants to check that out. One other interesting real fast is I was thinking about this slide with the home ownership piece, and while we were at Capital one interesting thing that we went through with any policy is we actually had a team that was separate from any of our specific work teams that was specifically designed to look at the analyses that we were doing and to try to gauge if they were basically being proxies for like racial or harmful like policies. So an example is like with credit, if you look at like certain zone, like you kind of connect your credit history to certain like homeownership regions. You could basically like be like, oh, these communities, these neighborhoods don't have great credit scores, where it's a proxy for like basically like perpetuating this like lack of home ownership or this wealth gap. So it's basically like trying to call out things that might be perpetuating this history, but not having anything to do with race on like as a direct variable. So I thought it was really cool that, at least we can speak from Capital One perspective, but I'm sure other financial institutions have it too, that they're trying to build teams to say like, let's make sure this isn't a proxy for something that could adversely affect minority communities. And I thought it was really cool that there's like a whole separate team devoted to like looking at every policy before we implement it. So I think that was actually a cool sign of progress.
I'll go ahead and keep us moving here to some of our other topics, but I think this is gonna, there are some themes that kind of continue on. So 2 down, we'll talk about the school to prison pipeline. But for the next one, we'll just talk a bit about leadership gaps in business and government. So Obasi, if you want to talk about this slide.
Yeah. So I think, there's a couple of notable exceptions to leadership gaps. I think there's one very, very notable exception, which is Obama was the president. And I think a lot of people, like when Obama became president, I think there was, a significant group of people who kind of started to think, well, Black people have, can get anything now, or Black people have kind of like broken all of this, I guess, glass ceilings there are for Black people because we have a Black president. But in reality, Obama was very much an exception. We don't see a lot of Black people in very high positions of leadership. We see Black people in, kind of middle leadership positions a lot of times, but a lot of the top spots are generally reserved for for generally white men, but you don't see a lot of Black people in a lot of these positions. An example is that the number of Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies reached an all-time high this year. There were six out of 500, which is about 1%. It tied for 2012 was the other time that there were six. But it has kind of like stayed very, very low. The number of Black US senators is also at an all-time high, tying 2019 after Kamala Harris became ran for president and became the vice president. She left her position, and then Raphael Warnock came in. And so now we have three, Cory Booker, Raphael Warnock, and what's his name? The Republican guy, Tim Scott from Texas. So not a lot of Black senators, but I think that's an interesting point too, is that one kind of caveat to this is that in the House, there's 438 approximately members of the House, and that in the House, there actually are approximately 13%, which is about the U.S. population, Black people. And so that's a very, like, a genuinely good thing. But the House is kind of, again, the kind of lower level of the two chambers. In the Senate, there's 100. In the House, there's 438 of them. And so you'll see higher representation among Black people in positions that are not the most prestigious positions, but there's a lot of I think reluctance to elevate Black people to like positions of high leadership. And so again, like, there are no Black governors being kind of the highest position of leadership in a state government. You just don't have any right now. And this is kind of like, these numbers have been kind of historically pretty stable as just being very, very low. The interesting thing you see on the other side of this is, so this ethnicity representation graph, it's probably hard to read what's going on there, but it's basically showing, it's like white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islander, and then other / multiracial are the categories. So the first one is the white, and then the bar right next to it, the really tiny little bar, is Black people. And what you see, and so this is by career levels. And so the graph all the way on the left-hand side is executives, then the next is senior managers and managers and professionals, and then support staff and operations staff. And so you'll see that the Black bar kind of grows and grows and grows, while the white bar kind of shrinks and shrinks and shrinks as the portion of people in those roles. And so a lot of companies, I'm always skeptical when I see, because I'm in hiring and stuff, you see companies talk about, well, we are working on improving the number of Black people in our workforce. Like, we are, almost at parity, or we have 13% Black people in our workforce, or we're getting close to that. A lot of people will pride themselves on. But if you look at the numbers more deeply, what you'll find is that Black people are generally very overrepresented in the lowest paid positions in those workplaces. And the highest positions will have very, very few Black people. So it's even if you look at, there are signs of progress in that kind of middle range. There are Black people in senior management positions, but generally speaking, they're still very underrepresented in those positions, and are very overrepresented in service roles, support roles, and operations roles. So that's that slide.
Yeah, and I'll just add something there personally too before going to the next slide, which is just at Capital One, I very much saw this directly. So I came in, I guess you could say, at professional level, coming out of Dartmouth, so out of a more privileged position. And then when I left to go to business school, I was at that manager level. But as I kind of looked around me, there were very few people kind of in that track that I was on at Capital One who were Black, but I knew we had that 13%. Capital One would talk about having the same percentage of Black employees as there are Black citizens. But then as I kind of dug into it more, I did find that most of the Black people at Capital One were working in the call centers or in the branches as a branch teller, which is very different from the people who were kind of able to be on that track that would make it to a leadership position within kind of the center of the bank. So that was kind of directly seeing that of the difference between support staff. And so they're, working on it. Similar for women, not a lot of women at the highest levels of leadership in these banks or Fortune 500 companies. But that's kind of where there is still this gap here. And so we'll talk a little bit in the next slide about some organizations that are working on this. So the left-hand side and the right-hand side are a little bit different here, but just focus on the left-hand side first. MLT is a program that I actually have gone through myself. It's called Management Leadership for Tomorrow. And they do a lot of work. It was founded by a Black man who graduated from Harvard Business School. And he felt that he had very little awareness of how to go through his business school application process, of how to be successful there, and decided he wanted to kind of give back to other minorities who were trying to reach high levels of education. And so this first stat just talks a bit about one of the programs they have, which is around helping Black and Latino and Native American men and women who are interested in business school. They can apply for this program. As you see here, like 95% of the people who get through this program. So it's a coaching program. It helps with test prep, and they help raise your test scores. The GMAT is the test you take for business schools. They raise their score significantly, and then at least 80% of the students in that program get scores that are competitive for top 20 business schools. And so that program, they actually have expanded now. They also work with minority students in colleges, help them with their interview prep, with getting connections with companies who are trying to bring in more minorities into professional positions. And then they even have programs now for people who are middle managers who are trying to get to that executive level, who are, again, minorities, and they have executive kind of coaching programs. So it's been really good to see this organization. And like I said, for myself, going to business school, I applied for and was able to get into this organization as well, to help me kind of on that development process. And then one of the other things they do is they actually do then work with companies directly. They reach out to companies and kind of help companies find these talented and educated rising kind of Black youth in colleges and business school. So for those companies like Capital One who are trying to bring in more minorities at these higher level positions, they kind of help to make that connection for them. Also in the bottom here, you can see it says many companies have increased their diversity hiring efforts over the past 3 years. And so this is just one poll that polls a variety of employers in different industries, but just showed that over the past 6 years, I think even especially in the last 2 years or so, there's been more and more of a jump of companies that have a formal program of diversity recruiting, which I think is just to say that it's acknowledging that there are still these gaps, even as there aren't these kind of formal barriers to entry for people of color, but that there are these informal ways of people not having access. So one thing actually we talk a lot about at LinkedIn is the network gap, which is just this idea that if you know somebody who works at a company or that can get you a referral to come in at an entry level position, like that, if you think back then over the last couple of generations, who's more likely to know someone at a bank or a consulting firm or a marketing firm that could give a referral. And of course, the networks of people that Black people and other minorities don't have those professional networks that are as broad. And so these diversity recruiting efforts then try to kind of help close that gap by reaching out more directly and helping people get in the door, as opposed to kind of considering that it's all equal and just saying whoever applies, we just look at them. Like the reality is a lot of times people do get jobs through personal referrals. So doing more to kind of close that gap. On the right-hand side here, it talks a little bit about how diversity is actually good for a company's bottom line. And this is something that a lot of different companies and consulting firms have started researching and talking about. So this is BCG, which is a prominent consulting firm. What they found was that they looked at the diversity of different companies, and then they looked at the revenue they would get from kind of innovative projects, so projects that are kind of trying to get into a different business space or a different product, and what they found was that more diverse companies would have would earn higher revenues of innovation. And what we've talked about a bit in business school around that is the concept too that as you surround yourself with people who are similar to you, you often also get ideas that are similar, right? And as you kind of get a broader set of life experiences and perspectives and ideas, then you start to have conversations even with about business and strategy that can actually help companies come up with ways to serve different populations or new ideas for different businesses. And so that's something that thankfully has been shared more and more with companies, and it's starting to get, I think, more traction to say like diversity, isn't just good for the value itself, but is also good for the bottom line. And what's interesting, of course, I've heard people criticize that approach by saying, companies should be seeking diversity just because it is a good value. But at the end of the day, of course, you need people to see some of the value. You need for a business to see some of the value itself and to see the value for itself, see the value of the bottom line. So it's been good that these kind of studies have been coming out to prove that diversity does help everybody. And I think at the end of the day, too, it's also a matter of like the more you have a position open to everybody, the more you have just the opportunity to bring a bigger pool of people who might be able to do better, right? So if you limit the pool of people you're looking at, you may not find the best person for a particular position or a particular idea. Whereas, of course, if you're looking at more people and bringing in more people, you're more likely to find people who have skills and talents that are needed for each company. So, yeah. So with that, Diane, I don't know if you just wanted to share even just a bit about just interacting with the diverse ideas and diverse mindsets as you've gotten into college and higher levels of professional companies.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with a lot of what you sort of said, and I think I would just add, like, personally, like my own experience as a white person in the workplace. I've been on like a range of different teams, and one of the ones in one of my consulting jobs was probably like one of the most diverse teams I worked with racially, especially both from like people who are from the U.S. and of different races and people who are from other countries as well. And the dynamics were definitely like along with what you sort of said, like there's just a lot more, like we talked about different issues from different angles. And one specific example is that one of the leaders, she's actually a Black woman, like she really helped our team like think about how like what we're doing is going to translate to some of the field like teams that we were working with. And so just it made me realize, especially like I wouldn't even think about how things might be interpreted in a different way to different groups that we were like trying to work with. And so that was just like one specific example, but just overall I have like always just really appreciated just like the diversity of thought. And I think now in business school, thinking a lot about entrepreneurship, I feel like this concept is like just starting to creep in, especially to like venture capital and startup world, because so little funding goes to minority founders as well. But it's been cool to see a lot of funds that are focused on backing minority founders and just how both they can take on current industries in a different way, but also like, again, find new industries and new opportunities that that they have a unique perspective on. And so it's been encouraging to see that start to change. So it's a long way to go, but just overall, I've always just continue to be impressed at how much more diverse teams, even if like it brings up more ways that you have to like engage in harder conversations or just get more pushback. That's a healthy pushback that I think always leads to better outcomes from a team, rather than just having people who all think one way and then to realize after the fact that wasn't the best way to handle things. So yeah, this is my 2 cents, my experiences. I've like experienced that improvement in my work experience, and I appreciate that like companies are starting to realize that it's like diverse perspectives and experiences are such an asset, even if it means you have to like engage in like more direct conversations and challenges.
Great, and so we'll open this section up for any general thoughts or questions.
Durante, no, he's blacked out, but I think he actually worked, you actually worked as a mentor for boys, is this correct? In high school to help them get into college. Is that right, Durante?
Well, I wasn't their direct mentor, but I ran the programs that did that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought about that because you mentioned you went through a program, and Durante, did you do
Yeah.
something similar to that? Would you say that?
As far as like leadership development.
Yeah, or
Yeah,
was it
well,
different?
no, I don't think I went through any programs that were specifically like, there are a lot of programs that are focused on the development of young Black men. And there are programs now being created specifically for young Black and brown women and young girls. But the programs that I went through, like I think one was Posse, the Posse Foundation. Theirs isn't race based. I mean, their structure kind of engages with that question, but like their kind of thing is like we're looking for the best leaders in general, are people who have the potential to be leaders. But I will say, like for Brothers At, which was the nonprofit I was leading, the foundation for how we taught mentors to be leaders was very much focused on how people lead in our communities. So like very, very different than what you would see in a corporate space, but also very similar. So like at Huron, where I work, one thing that Huron likes to talk about is stories, like building stories for your clients. And also part of that is like for yourself so you can connect with your client, right? For our young men of color, we taught them how to talk about their stories, but not necessarily for, other people or to sell themselves, but as a form of healing, right? And as a form of reflection. So, and I do see a handful of Black leaders in the nonprofit and corporate space challenging the way we see leadership in those spaces and incorporating a lot of the values that allow, I think, Black and brown people to excel in their communities and also in other spaces as well.
Yeah. Thanks for.
I was just going to say, to piggyback, just Durante, it's interesting to hear that you were in Posse because we're working as the director of a homeschool program, but we're trying to get kids into we can nominate kids for Posse. But I'm just impressed with that program too. But it's similar to what Yesuto was talking about to the extent that it's trying to provide support and the whole idea of a posse is the idea that you're going through something with people. And I think that that's one of the things with looking at things in a more diverse way, that a lot of times, some people have this idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and you did it on your own. You're all independent. It's all about just what I did for myself by myself. Whereas other communities always thinking about the group, the Hispanic community and the Black community are thinking more about being a part of a group and going through things. And so this idea that you have the support of your community, you're trying to build communities amongst young people to have a support. And so I believe too, I think with your program, Yesuto, that you have to, that they're trying to follow up with you throughout, that you're not on your own. You're not just now just put out there and you're just supposed to be doing it on your own, but you're a part of a community. And that's just a different way of thinking, that people want to be a part of a community.
Yeah, want to, I think, and need to as well. I do think like that idea, like to your point of like the classic American independence and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. I think there is also an element of minority communities knowing that like if you're being forced, or if you're being faced with opposition, roadblocks, that just having support and other people who go through similar things can be helpful. Actually, that reminds me of something too of we'll talk a little about interpersonal dynamics moving forward, but even in colleges and universities, there's the conversation about like Black people sitting together, or why do you need a Black student union? Why don't you just have everybody fully integrated? And I think it's true that we want everyone fully integrated, but also that oftentimes you want people you want to be able to associate and get to talk to and collaborate with people who have gone through similar struggles as you, right? And so like that posse idea, or the idea of community, of like, especially if you're facing roadblocks, it's like, have you faced this before, and how did you manage that? Or how can we talk through how we can deal with this together? So I think like there's this kind of necessity of community too that you see with a lot of these minority organizations. Okay, we can keep moving here. Actually, I'll pause just for one more minute. But
I wanted to mention too that just as all of these programs, like Obama had a program also to develop Black voice, and I think we see in the media how seeing Black men do well in sports, for instance, and in football, basketball, baseball, whatever, it has led a lot of Black boys into that direction. And it just seems like the more we promote alternative forms of leadership in the media, the more, it's potentially going to draw. I feel like before the election of Obama as president, there were 2 or 3 movies with Black presidents in them, and a TV show and a couple of movies. And then it became kind of, interesting that people were actually ready, as culturally in America, to vote for a Black president. And I feel like it's, trying to change people's viewpoint and the way people have looked at Black males in the culture for, 100 years, whatever. It's been with Jim Crow and whatnot. There needs to be a concerted effort to not just change the boys' views of themselves, but to change the broader culture's view. And that's what I think is being done in the media, but I'm not sure how effective it's being done, but more media presence for, to try to suggest to the Black boys themselves that there are a whole lot of opportunities in other areas than just entertainment, than just football, rap, things like that. Those kind of things are I think right now steering kids into a certain mindset that there's only one direction that you can be successful in, and they need to hear more about other people who are successful outside of those areas, Black men, to really undo the damage.
It's a really good point. Mm-hmm. I think back when I was a child in the 80s and 90s, we didn't see, if you saw Black people and men in the media, they were not, you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, and I think for some reason, there was a long period of time where you didn't see Black male roles in leadership positions in movies, right? And that has started to change. You do see some very positive in the media, and I think maybe it takes a while for that to have the effect that we're hoping it will have, but I think it has had some effect.
Power of the media.
Yes, I know. But to do negative and to do harm and to do good. So it does both.
One comment I was gonna make that see in that we have within the communities I'm in.
No, he froze.
Jeff, I think we might have lost you.
Jeff?
Maybe his internet is having problems.
We can give him a second. All right.
Yeah, he'll come back.
Yeah. Okay. All right, sounds good. Any last comments on this one before we go on? All right, we'll come back to this when we get Jeff back for his comments as well. Oh, there we go, Jeff. Yes, I think we lost you there.
Well, I was going to say, even trying to find when we had positions of leadership positions that we were trying to find opportunity. The real result of it is because we didn't have the connections to people, we didn't have the relationships with people. It made even those that were trying to do that, so that requires you to be purposeful and intentional to develop relationships and interaction between cultures and churches and communities, so that when those opportunities are there, that's what fraternities live off of, is your ability to connections to people. And that's a lot of how people get their jobs in the future, is they just know somebody. And so, but boy, we've created through the racial history of our country such separation of communities and peoples that make that really hard to plow through.
No, I agree. I think, and I do think that's the struggle. The CEO of Wells Fargo, I believe, said something about how they wanted more Black people in leadership or minorities in leadership, but they just couldn't find them, or something along those lines.
Yeah, but I'm not trying to apply that that's not on the minorities. I'm saying it's on the leadership of these companies, and that's a direct failure on their part to try to pursue those kinds of connections.
No, definitely. And so, like, similarly, then Capital One started reaching out more directly to historically Black colleges and universities to try to build those connections with communities that are developing, I guess, Black professionals. So it's like, there are ways you can try to be more proactive, right, about making those connections and trying to find access to those communities. So definitely agree.
Yeah, the guy who founded MIT, I remember hearing him talk about that, and talking about how a lot of companies say that they just can't find enough qualified people, but he talks about the statistics and talks about how the qualified people are out there. But it's just a matter of you're connecting to them because they are there. And he has the statistics to show that they're out there.
Yeah. All right. So now we are going to talk a bit about the school to prison pipeline and kind of gaps within the criminal justice system. So Diana, if you want to talk about this slide.
Sure. So just quick history on kind of like the school to prison concept. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but it's centered on the idea that some policies, which specifically zero tolerance policies, have led to this pipeline where after a chain of events, it's more likely to lead minority communities, especially Black communities, to have later run-ins with the criminal justice system. This kind of came out of the 80s and 90s, and just a concern over violence growing in communities, especially schools. So zero tolerance policies essentially were saying there's like a standard for enforcement and discipline of behavior, which gives like that mixed with a lot of like prejudices just end up really adversely affecting especially Black communities, and not having any leniency for how to work with students and help address different things in a healthier way. So one of the statistics that they have as well, only 15% of public school students were Black. This is 2013, 2014. About 40% of the students suspended from schools are Black. And the students who attended schools with higher suspension rates were all more likely to, students were more likely to be arrested and jailed as adults. A part of and many reasons that like the suspensions and the overly harsh disciplines really adversely affect students. There's a direct implications. Some schools start to really actually tap into local law enforcement to actually enforce some of these policies. So kids were directly interacting with law enforcement at a really early age. There's also the psychology around it and just perpetuating racial biases and how staff and teachers view the potential of minority students affects how like students might also feel about their own potential in the future. It can just be really disheartening to be suspended and just to feel like you see so much potential in yourself, but especially just reinforce the biases a lot of teachers and staff might have against Black minority students. One quick aside example that I saw, not directly with the school to prison pipeline, but one of my best friends in college, she's Black, and in high school, like one of her teachers told her like to not even bother to apply to Ivy schools, and she ended up doing it anyways and got into Harvard. And it just kind of like, she didn't interact with the justice system, but it just was shocking to hear that like students, or it's a reminder how much staff could have the potential to impact the future of students and what they believe about themselves. So just really was disheartening to hear that like someone would dissuade her in that way. And last thing is just to know on this, that this school to prison pipeline is also really driven by disparities in the education quality and the high poverty schools where the majority of students are Black or Hispanic. High poverty schools tend to be majority Black or Hispanic and offer less college prep and other resources that would really help students continue to advance in a similar way. So as we talked about before, this closely ties to students' future opportunities, ties to the wealth gap like we talked about before, and then subsequently minority students' opportunities later in a career pipeline. So definitely one of the earliest points where racial biases start to really impact kids at a really young age. On the right, the chart shows out of school suspensions by gender, and you can see for both boys and girls, for Black students, it's significantly higher than a lot of the other races as well.
And then Christina, I think we'll talk a bit about signs of progress here.
Yeah, so a lot of schools are starting to recognize that those like zero tolerance policies, are extremely harmful to the long-term like prospects of students. And so there's been more of a focus on mental health and sort of getting to the root causes of why kids might act out in school, and rather than just punishing them, really trying to heal that harm that they've sort of like felt and then are consequently acting out on. So one thing that's not on the slide is like diagnosing students like ACEs, which stands ACES, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so a lot of like schools will screen students to see like how many of these they have, just to understand sort of what students, like what baggage students may be coming to like school with, and then like offering mental health resources and things to help them. We used to live in Seattle, Washington, and their local government had a trauma-informed care program. And so this would give a lot of like resources to nonprofits and schools that were doing work to like be more trauma sort of like informed. And then in school right now, public policy school, there's a trauma-informed course to understand how like to really address these sort of root causes of sort of the things that might lead people to become or to like engage in criminal activity. So there's a lot of movement in this kinds of like programs and the ways that we're helping like students and treating students. Some other things that are happening to counter the sort of impact of zero tolerance policies, or try to like to counter those policies, is civil rights like protections for students, and then also just integrating schools more, which has been a long-standing thing. but that specifically can, with the goal of giving access, or with the goal of giving students access to like a higher quality of, schooling. A related outcome, it's not like we can draw sort of a link from these efforts to this other stat, but a parallel trend I guess we see is prison rates declining over time. And this is also true for the Black, this is also true for the Black, population. So Black people's imprisonment rates have fallen by 34% from 2006 to 2018. And we'll see, how that sort of plays out longer term, but it is an encouraging trend right now.
Yeah, I actually hadn't seen this chart until this presentation was put together. So it is promising to hear, as we just talked about, the difficulties and the negative impacts of the criminal justice system. And clearly, we can see that there's still a significant gap here in terms of how many Black people are in prison in comparison to other races, but just to see progress is promising. But then it goes kind of to the overall point too, that it'll take a long time to really get to equality, right, or fairness. It's like there's such a large gap, or such long history of discrimination and these discriminatory policies that it's an ongoing challenge to get to true equality. So, any questions or comments on the school to prison pipeline?
It was very helpful to see those numbers, and I also, it's sad to see the fact that during COVID, it hasn't been a positive,
Yeah, definitely.
So it's been going a little in the other direction, right? I think, unfortunately, with COVID.
Yeah.
What was attributed to the decline occurring between 2006 and 18? Is there any thought to why that trend got better during that period?
I know that crime rates have fallen. Specifically, violent crime has fallen a lot over that time period. So, but I'm sure that there's like a number of factors, but certainly the just general decline in crime.
Yeah, and also the war on drugs has been a insignificant decline in that period.
I don't use any drugs. I hate to say it that way, but there's been a big movement to decriminalize a number of, types of drugs, marijuana and whatnot. And I'm not advocating that, especially with my kids on the call here. Don't want to send the wrong message, but it seems like that's going in the right direction.
Yeah, you shouldn't be putting people in prison for that.
Yeah, seems like that would also line. I mean, it would take people's, prison records. It would give less people prison records if they were, and not with nonviolent offenses, if they were not getting in prison for that.
Can you show the slide right before this? I kind of missed the graph on the right a little bit. What's that graph? Maybe I missed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I find interesting about this graph is just looking at it is, so it shows the number of suspensions for students, or the percent of students of a particular race that get suspended by race and gender. So on the left-hand side, it's boys, and the right-hand side, it's girls. And it's actually really interesting to me. Like I'm talking now because I found this graph really interesting. That 20% of Black boys like experience an out-of-school suspension, and then you'll see that the next one over, or the next one down, is that orange one. That orange one is American Indian or Alaska Natives and Native Americans, and then you have like multiracial, and then it kind of goes down and down and down, and then you have white and Asian down at the two bluish ones. But that's what this graph is showing. I mean, you'll see for girls the numbers are lower, but then the trends are still similar.
And what's interesting it sort of reemphasizes that the kids are already, when they're in school, already experiencing some, they're disturbed by what's going on in the system, right? They're already experiencing some lack of adjustment. They're not really adjusting well. And yet they get punished for it. And then there's a cycle where it just gets worse and worse. We know after the first arrest, you're likely to be arrested over and over and over again, instead of finding a way to resolve it before it becomes an arrest.
Yeah, Yasi, were you saying that I was interpreting it wrong? That it said the number? I think you're right. Yeah. You can explain that.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was trying to count it. I think it adds up to 100%. So I think it's out of all the students who are suspended, that 20% of all students are Black boys. And then I think that's really significant too, because like if you look at American Indian and Alaska Native, like the percentage of the population that is much smaller even than Black Americans, and so that you would have 13% of collective and girls, at 20% of people who receive suspensions are American Indian, Alaska Native is really surprising. But again, I think part of the issue here being, and there have been various studies too about just how even teachers might treat Black girls versus white girls differently, and that people tend to see Black girls as being kind of older in some way, so they don't give them as much of a break even of in terms of performance or talking back or like behavioral issues in school. And so I think just that element of how teachers might react to students of color, of various minority races, in comparison to how they might react to white students who have similar behavior.
Just to speak about like the drug thing, but about this too. It's a mindset as far as whether or not people see these kids or even the people who use drugs, sees them as criminals, as, like they're criminals versus people who need help. And so, and when Christina was talking about the programs, that idea is that you start seeing that people need help and not, the punishment. They need the help. And so I believe that when I said the difference between somebody in our country being locked up for drugs and in other countries, what do? Well, there are things where you can actually, force somebody to go through counseling. You can force somebody to do community service. You can force somebody to do those kinds of things that are possibly going to be helpful to them, rather than just locking them up and seeing that this person's not going to change. And a lot of times it's not even major. It's not major issues. It's these nonviolent things. I mean, with the kids, they're kids, and we were talking about that yesterday. These are kids, and you can affect kids, and you should be able. So you should be putting even more counseling into their lives, putting into even more finding out what's going on at home, what's going on, whatever. When you find a kid that's in a fight, rather than saying, well, send them off to juvenile detention. There's probably something that's causing wherever they are. And I think it's just the mindset of society. Do you look at these people as criminals that should be locked up, or do you look at them as people that you can work with? And we were talking about it last week with the book and the whole idea of the whole drug thing, that when it came to the opioids, you started seeing the people who were addicted as victims, as, people who needed help. It's a crisis now for the whole country to come together and help these people, rather than when you did the whole crack cocaine and all of that stuff from before, it was, these criminals that need to be locked up. And so all depends on how you want to look at the people that are involved in these different things. And so, because there were addicts who were the opioid, they were addicts just like addicts on the other drugs. And so are we going to try to help people, or are we going to try to just lock them up?
And I think too, there's this, and I also wanted to say that this groups like this, the racial reconciliation groups, are very much helping to change and to move the needle, I think, in the right direction. But I think, just the idea that we don't see investing in kids, like putting money into the school system as investing in the future of America. It seems to me we really don't think of kids like, the best, opportunity to help our future, help somehow we're pulling back, the money that schools have. Their budgets are shrinking instead of the opposite, where, if we invest in kids, the country's going to do better in general, when these kids, become adults. So I know the idea of the GI Bill, really after World War II, the huge investment in education built the middle class. They say after World War II, a huge investment in those GIs coming back built the biggest middle class in the world in terms of percentage. And we have stopped investing in education on that level. We just don't. We didn't take that lesson and believe that investing in education builds our country in a positive direction. I mean, it just we're sort of seeing people don't trust putting money into schools anymore, and they don't trust schools anymore. I mean, this backlash against schools that's going on around the country because of culture wars. I think it's sad. I'm a pastor, a Christian. I know there's different cultures, but these are kids. We need to invest in them. I just don't see it as being right to criminalize kids. But
I'm going to push us forward just to our last topic here. Let me jump forward, which is on interpersonal dynamics and interactions. So what's interesting, of course, is like when you think of racism, traditionally, a lot of times people think only about the interpersonal, but we actually saved it for last because I think it is probably the one where there's been the most progress and hopefully kind of the least areas of failure. But of course, we're still not at a place where everyone treats people equally. So Obasi, I will turn it over to you for this one.
Yeah, I won't be talking about the progress here. So hopefully somebody can pick that up on the next slide. So there are two things here. One, that's kind of a sign of things going wrong is the resurgence of white supremacist movements. So you're seeing a lot of, incidents of white supremacist propaganda hit an all-time high in 2020. As kind of these kind of racial tensions are growing, and as Black Lives Matter has grown, there has been kind of a opposite movement as well that's been growing of people who are becoming more and more vocally very race or anti-Black or pro white supremacy. So that's been kind of a dangerous and disappointing growth in recent times. But then the other thing here is something I find really interesting, which is very much what Jeff was talking about, or very much ties into what Jeff was talking about a few minutes ago, about how it's just hard to find the Black people for that specific role because they didn't know any of these Black people. I mean, that's what I find to be one of the most interesting aspects of how systemic racism happens in America, is that it doesn't even necessarily need to be white people doing harm to other racial groups. It's more just the fact that white people are going to help white people, and wealth that white people have, they're going to transfer only to other white people, and they're going to kind of keep those things within their communities. And so if you have historically excluded Black people from something, like redlining being an example, you historically create these barriers that Black people have to live in these kind of ghettos or segregated out of these communities. You start in this kind of baseline where there is, white people have all of these things because they've created the world or the society in this way, and Black people don't. And then if you maintain the segregation, then the economic resources that are available to white people continue to be available to white people, and the growth and as Jeff was also pointing out about that first slide with the white household wealth growing along with inflation, that kind of makes sense if you think about inflation being something that's happening in this broader community that white people have access to. But for Black people, they just don't have access to the growth opportunities that are supposed to be happening in society. And so one kind of stat to make this clear is there was a study done that showed that 77% of white Americans, this was in 2021, I think, 77% of white Americans say that their core social network is exclusively white. So basically all of their closest friends are white. And 56% of Black Americans say that their core social network is exclusively Black. And so what that means is that when the white American is looking to share or is looking for a new marketing manager or whatever, they're going to look around at their social network and they're going to say, oh, I know, Joe, who knows, Lisa, who knows whoever, who's going to be great for this. And that person is almost certainly going to be white. Whereas the Black people don't have those marketing manager roles that they're trying to fill because they haven't even gotten to gotten the access to that wealth yet. So one other interesting thing here is the image here is this thing called the parable of the polygons, which I find to be really interesting. I'm going to share the link here. Just going to paste it in the chat so that if anybody wants to click on it, they can. It's this kind of fun little website game that shows what it looks like or how segregation can happen even when the individuals aren't particularly racist or whatever. And so what this basically shows, and we don't have to walk through it because it takes some time to go through, but if anybody wants to go through it on your own, you can, is that even if each person decides I only want to live in a place where a third of the people around me are my type of person. In this case, it's circle or squares versus triangles. But I want to be in a place where at least a third of people are like me. What happens is that people will naturally self-segregate into these pretty segregated areas, even if you don't start with segregation. And we started with segregation, so it becomes very, very difficult. But the kind of happy spin on this is that the way to end segregation is if you scroll down kind of to the bottom of this page, a little further. Up a little bit, up one more, a little bit here. Scroll down, sorry, here. So right here, yes. So if you go, but if everybody says that they want to move, if 90% of the people, or if more than 90% of the people around them are like them, that actually will eliminate segregation, which is interesting. So if people just kind of have a slight bias towards diversity instead of a slight bias towards sameness, that in itself can, make people say, well, I'm not happy with my entire social network being white. I need to make sure that at least one of my close friends is Black or is some other race. If everybody were to say that, then you'd actually naturally be ending these cycles. But instead, people are more I get uncomfortable when there are too many people who aren't like me around me. So it's just an interesting thing to think about is maybe if we were just uncomfortable instead with too many people around us who are like us instead of the other way around, we would just even naturally be ending these cycles of segregation. So that's everything from that slide for me.
I don't know if it just occurred to me when you said this, that when we are getting married and having children and whatnot, it's bad for it's bad if the genetic material, if you marry a sister or a brother or whatever, in a few generations there starts to become negative consequences from that. And if the genetic diversity helps the children grow into good directions. And I anyway, but we're having this thing where we obviously have gotten to a place of distrusting each other in this country after, the history of hostility between Blacks and whites. And so we don't want to go and try to live in peace with one another. I mean, I think the main thing is I think the adults have more trouble than the children with this issue. But the hostility just grows if you don't do something to build those bridges. And in the other case, where a lot of kids don't see why they need to be angry or hostile, because they just didn't grow up around Jim Crow. They just didn't grow up around all these ideas. And so they're much more open to Blacks and whites, being together. So hopefully that's the future, right?
To the hope, right?
Yeah, is that the hope slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, you jumped the gun a little bit, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
But no, I mean, it does get to your point though of I guess, well, it's interesting because like this concept of white supremacist groups resurging, it's like, are we facing a time where there is some elements of people passing on that racial anger and hatred on to the next generation and spreading that in ways where people who maybe aren't in very diverse populations, there are some kids who are picking up on that, unfortunately. And so just, I think it speaks to the importance of continuing to speak against it and like not assume that we are at a place where everyone interpersonally generally thinks that all races should be considered equal, but that we have to continually reaffirm that because there are those of prior generations who do have these white supremacist ideas who are starting to find ways to pass those on kind of through the internet and such to the new generation. So hopefully that trend reverses. But yes, we were trying to think through how to show signs of failure and what you could show kind of statistically, and the way to show how to show signs of progress. The way to show that you've truly accepted someone of another race is if you marry them. So there's the most direct way to show kind of interpersonal interactions, and of course Diana and I have dealt with the concept of interracial marriage and whether or not it's accepted by society, or just even if it's like seems uncommon or seems strange to people. But what we've seen here in terms of kind of statistics on this is that even just in kind of the 25 years between 1980 and 2015, seeing the percentage of interracial marriages increased from 7% to 17%. And then it also is interesting because if you do get to a point where a lot of Americans are interracial or multiracial, then it's unclear like how you categorize kind of different races and what does it mean to hold kind of racist ideas and ideals. And so I think it actually does lead to people being, I guess, the more that you kind of are integrating, the less you have like opportunities for racism if you have less of that stark kind of divide between races. But of course, that isn't the only kind of sign of progress. And so beyond that, we didn't have specific stats around that, but did just want to talk a little bit about like some of our experiences. And so I think like for me in particular, I do feel like going to college. So growing up, actually, I would say I feel like I grew up with a fairly mixed kind of group of Black and white friends in my community within Georgia, within the homeschool community, within the Christian community. But I think interestingly, when I went to college, actually, I found that I expanded the diversity of my friend group even more in ways that I hadn't expected, which was just to say that I found friends who were Asian friends or Latina friends, a lot of Indian friends, and realized, I guess, how broad the diversity is, not just in the world, but even in America, and that there's also still a lot of kind of segregation of immigrants and their children in comparison to Black Americans who have been here for a long time. So just seeing the growth of the integration of communities within college and then now within business and then business school, I've just seen a really great kind of melting pot, even more so kind of in my friend groups and in my coworkers today. So does any Obasi, Christina, Diana want to share anything else about that?
About a minute to speak each.
Okay.
I guess one thing I could talk a little bit about is that's kind of what I spend most of my time trying to do in work now, is trying to like increase those or increase access to the tech industry for people of color, because I think to me it's just really important that people have access to these communities where the wealth is. I think that there's a lot of wealth in tech, as everybody knows, but there's also just a lot of barriers to get into that community. And I think that simply making it so that there are more people of color in these positions who have access to the wealth of tech means that they can then spread that wealth into their own communities. And so the just kind of leadership is important and representation is important, but also just the fact of people being around each other and people being in the spaces that where people share all of the like tips and wealth and loans and whatever else that it is that people have, I think is very, very important. So that's what I focus a lot on these days.
I'll share. So I was just talking to a friend, it's just very top of mind. I was talking to a friend in policy school with me, and she comes from a low income, like Black, household background, and she went to somebody's friend's house for Thanksgiving, like a white friend's house, and now she's thinking about a totally different sort of like job, opportunity. So it's just a very obvious example of interracial sort of like friendships really mattering for economic sort of opportunity, which is a big reason I think why interracial like marriages and friendships matter for those longer term sort of economic opportunities that they can provide as well.
Yeah. I'll just briefly add, I think the encouraging part is whether it's like the relationships or friendships or other interactions. I think any relationship people can build with people of like any different type of community always helps build empathy and understanding. And I think like for a lot of the other slides that we saw before, a lot of the change has to come from like just getting to know people in different communities. And so it is really encouraging to see that, because until then it's easy to like stereotype or categorize or just like make people an other group. And I think like it has to start with building relationships. So I think there's a lot to be hopeful for.
Hand it back over to Rachel, but yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
Well, this presentation's amazing. It's really awesome. Wow. I mean, I can see this presentation working in many places. I don't know if you have thoughts of taking it other places, but I think the leaders of one race, Dan Crane, they would be like, wow, this is really great. Great teaching. That was really good. And I learned a few things. Like I was really surprised. I was surprised in the wealth gap. Gosh, I'm forgetting, but that it's more now than it used to be. Mm-hmm. That really surprised me. Was it the wealth gap? Was that it? Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that was right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Versus the 1960s.
But I also thought this was very positive. Like you guys really pointed out all the positive things. And I thought it was very encouraging, because we get bogged down on all the negative a lot. Mm-hmm. And like you said, it's going to take a long time for racism to really be gone, but it's very slow progress. So that was encouraging to see the progress that's been made. Anyway, I thought it was very good.
Can I ask one quick question? The statistic about the relationship, 77% of white America, has friendships versus 56. So it means the 56 are basically taking care of that whole 23%, whatever.
Well, but, yeah, it's actually, go on, sorry.
But I'm betting it does.
Yeah.
But my question is this, is that are you guys in your generation seeing a much more diverse friendship relationships, which then translates to a future where we're much less, we're moving toward that, or do you not see that?
I would personally say that I think it's really hard to say because I think that we are all kind of in a certain socioeconomic class where we encounter a lot of non-Black people. But what I would say is that I think that the country is just becoming so much more diverse. Like if you looked at demographic statistics for like people under the age of 25, like Gen Z, it's so different from demographic statistics for, boomers or whatever, because the kids growing up are just so much more like Hispanic, and like immigrants. And so I would be surprised if it was not the case that people are just having to interact with a lot more people who are outside of their race growing up.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would say though that also, like a bit to my dad's point, I think about like people having like more racial animus in prior generations. Like I do feel like as I interact with people in this generation, like almost never have I ever felt any sense of like someone treated me differently. I think there have been like a couple of small occasions, but I do think like the degree to which people have opportunities to interact, I think people, generally speaking, are more willing to see each other as equals and have no reason to look at each other differently than that. I think but the questions are like, how much do we still see kind of segregation in different communities? So I think like as schools do more to try to integrate more fully, and as colleges and universities do that as well, I think that kind of naturally helps create those relationships. So I do think we're going in the right direction with that.
Did you all grow up in Georgia?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
Right outside of Atlanta, on mountain.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Where did you grow up, Diana?
I grew up in Florida on the East Coast.
East Coast. What about you, Christina? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, Cleveland.
Cleveland. Okay.
Thank you, guys. This was really amazing. And I do hope we have this forum at some point. Well done.
Yeah, I think we can talk about that after too. But yeah, no, thank you for pushing us to pull it together. Like you said, maybe it would be helpful to share in other forums. But yeah, so we pulled it together for tonight. So hopefully we can continue to use it for other purposes. Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome anytime. You're welcome to join anytime. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And Alan, you live in the same home as Michelle.
Yes, I know. I've never seen you. I'm never in the meeting, so I definitely.
You're always welcome.
I did tell a friend who was trying to
join the book club.
Join the book club.
You might try to come to the book club.
Sure, great. Yeah, and you guys are welcome to come to the book club if you're able. I know you're in college. You probably you're welcome if you would like to. Yeah, and it was relevant to what's going on in this book too, when we got to what you guys spoke about.
Yeah. 100%.
Excellent presentation. Good facilitating, Rachel. Great job, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne. Joanne, did you want to say something when they were talking about the youth? You unmuted yourself for a second. You're like, amen. I agree with that. The children are the future.
They are the future.
Did you unmute it on purpose, or was that
no? It was accidental.
Oh, okay. I was like, she's saying amen. Okay. Okay.
So should we close in prayer? What do we?
Yes, we could. Yes. Yes. Who would like to close in prayer?
One of the young people would be nice. The future, one of the future people.
Yes, absolutely.
I can close.
Okay.
Thank you. Dear God, thank you for this gathering. Thank you for letting us all come together. Thank you for this group that has been meeting together and doing the work of ending kind of these racial divides just by being community and caring for each other. Thank you for allowing us all to be here, and thank you for those who will be watching this afterwards. I pray that this will be the discussions that we've had right now will bear fruit in various ways in all of our lives. And I pray that we all leave here invigorated to do good. And in your name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Nice to meet Michelle's family.
Yeah.
All right.
Me
Okay.
too.
Y'all have a good night.
Bye.